There is a loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unseen while surrounded by eyes that look but never truly perceive. You have felt this, I know. You have stood in rooms full of voices and felt the silence of your own spirit echoing back to you, unmet, unrecognized, as if you speak a language the world has forgotten how to hear. This is not a failure of connection. This is the mark of a mind that moves through different waters, that sees beneath surfaces others mistake for depth, that carries questions the world has long since stopped asking. The psychologists name these patterns now, categorize them, explain them with their careful words and measured tones. But what they describe is ancient. It is the way certain souls have always walked through this world, bearing a weight that feels both burden and gift, unable to unsee what they have seen, unable to unhear what whispers beneath the noise of ordinary living. You do not choose this way of being. It chooses you, or perhaps it was always there, waiting for the world to teach you that your natural vision was somehow wrong, that the depths you perceived were imagined, that the connections you sensed were foolish. And so you learned, as sensitive creatures learn, to question your own knowing, to doubt the very instrument through which you perceive reality, to wonder if perhaps everyone else is right and you are simply too much, too intense, too deep, too difficult to understand. But the mind does not change its nature by being told it should. It only learns to hide, to compress, to present a version of itself that might finally be acceptable to those who move through shallower streams. This is the first exile, the original departure from home. Not when others reject you, but when you begin to reject yourself, when you start to see your own depth as defect, your sensitivity as flaw, your difference as distance that must somehow be closed. The psychologists speak of pattern recognition, of the way certain minds naturally perceive connections that others miss, see systems within chaos, detect meaning in what appears random to the conventional gaze. They call this divergent thinking, as if it were a deviation from some true path, rather than simply a different road through the same wilderness. You have always done this, have you not? Seen the threads that bind seemingly unrelated moments, felt the resonance between a stranger's passing expression and a truth you carry deep within your bones, known things before you could name why you knew them. The world taught you to distrust this knowing, to wait for proof, to doubt your own perception until someone with authority confirmed what you had already sensed. And so you learn to silence the very gift that makes you who you are, to apologize for seeing clearly, to diminish your vision so others might feel comfortable in their chosen blindness. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from translating yourself constantly, from taking the intricate poetry of your inner world and flattening it into prose, simple enough for those who do not wish to read deeply. You have done this countless times, have you not? Shaped your truth into smaller words, gentler revelations, explanations that would not overwhelm or unsettle those who prefer their reality neat and contained. This is not kindness, though you may have told yourself it was. This is a slow erosion of self, a gradual disappearing of your own essence, in service of making others comfortable with their own limitations. The psychologists might call this social adaptation, might frame it as a necessary skill for navigating human connection, but they rarely speak of the cost, of what happens to a soul that spends its lifetime translating itself into a language it does not naturally speak. You feel things at depths that frighten people, not because your feelings are wrong or excessive, but because they reveal the possibility of dimensions most have learned to avoid, territories of the heart and spirit that require more courage than the ordinary day allows. The psychologists name this high sensitivity now, give it frameworks and explanations. But what they describe is as old as consciousness itself. There have always been those who feel the weight of the world more heavily, who cannot pass by suffering without it entering them, who carry not just their own grief, but the unspoken sorrows of everyone they encounter. You know this intimately, the way a room's emotional temperature becomes your own, the way another's pain settles into your body as if it belonged there, the way joy and sorrow alike move through you with an intensity that leaves you breathless and bewildered. The world tells you this is too much, that you should build better boundaries, protect yourself, learn to care less, feel less, be less affected by the endless tide of human experience that washes over you daily. But you cannot learn to feel differently any more than you can learn to have different eyes. The sensitivity is not a choice you made. It is the instrument through which you perceive reality, and no amount of willing it otherwise will change the fundamental nature of your perception. What changes is only your relationship to this truth, your willingness to honor it rather than fight it, to see it as the profound gift it is rather than the burden you were taught to believe it must be. There are moments when you know things you have no logical reason to know, when understanding arrives not through deduction or analysis, but through some deeper channel of awareness that defies explanation. The psychologists study intuition now, try to map its mechanisms, explain how the unconscious mind processes patterns beneath conscious awareness, and delivers conclusions that feel like knowing without learning. But this clinical description cannot capture the experience of it. The way truth sometimes announces itself in your body before your mind can catch up, the way recognize destiny in a chance meeting, danger in a smile that seems warm to everyone else, home in a place you have never been. You have learned not to speak of these knowings because the world demands evidence, requires proof, insists that feeling is not a valid form of information. And so you doubt yourself, question these inner certainties, wait for external confirmation of what you already know in the deepest part of yourself. This is perhaps the cruelest training the sensitive soul receives, this teaching that your own inner knowing cannot be trusted, that you must always defer to external authority, to measurable data, to the consensus of those who have long since stopped listening to their own inner voice. But the knowing does not disappear simply because you refuse to honor it. It only grows quieter, more hesitant, less willing to offer its guidance when you have made clear you will not heed it. And then you wonder why you feel lost, disconnected from your own truth, adrift in a world that seems increasingly foreign to your spirit. You need solitude in ways that baffle those who find their energy in constant company, who cannot imagine choosing silence over social engagement, aloneness over connection. The psychologists explain this through temperament theory, through the mechanisms of nervous system regulation, through the ways different minds process stimulation and recover from its effects. But these explanations, while accurate, miss the deeper truth of what solitude means to certain souls. It is not merely rest or recovery, it is return, the coming back to yourself after hours or days of existing in translation, of presenting the acceptable version, of moving through a world that requires you to be smaller, simpler, more digestible than you actually are. In solitude, you can finally unfold, expand into your full dimensions, speak in your native language, even if only to yourself. Remember who you are beneath all the adaptations and compressions and careful presentations. The world judges this need harshly, frames it as antisocial or avoidant, suggests you are missing out on life by choosing your own company over the noise of crowds and the exhaustion of constant interaction. But you are not avoiding life. You are protecting your ability to actually live it, to remain connected to the depths within yourself that make existence meaningful rather than merely tolerable. Without this return to solitude, you become increasingly hollow, a shell performing connection while feeling none of it, words without resonance, presence without depth. The solitude is not escape from life, but the very thing that allows you to stay alive in any way that matters, to maintain contact with the source of your own being, rather than becoming just another voice in the chorus of those who have forgotten how to hear themselves. You think in layers, in spirals, in webs of connection that refuse to be linear, that will not be contained by the straight lines and simple progressions the world prefers. The psychologists call this complexity of thought, this tendency towards systemic rather than sequential thinking. And they note how it leads to both profound insight and profound misunderstanding, how a mind that sees everything in relation to everything else struggles to communicate with minds that prefer their thoughts, neat, separate, categorized into tidy compartments. You have experienced this countless times. The frustration of trying to share an understanding that requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that cannot be reduced to a single explanation, that needs time to unfold in its full intricacy, but is met with impatience, with demands for the simple answer, the clear takeaway, the message that can be grasped in a moment without requiring the listener to actually enter into the complexity you are describing. And so you learn to simplify, to choose one thread from the tapestry and pretend it represents the whole, to offer conclusions without the intricate journey that led to them, to speak in the language of certainty, even when your actual understanding is far more nuanced, more provisional, more aware of its own limitations. This is another translation, another compression of your natural way of thinking into forms more palatable to those who prefer their reality less complicated, but something essential is lost in this translation, some vital truth that exists only in the holding together of seeming contradictions, in the refusal to choose one explanation over another when both carry pieces of the larger truth. You know this loss intimately, this sense that what you actually think and what you can successfully communicate are two different things, that your real understanding lives in territories of thought you must venture into alone because no one else has patience for the journey. The future visits you in strange ways, not through mystical visions or supernatural revelation, but through a mind that cannot help but project patterns forward, that sees the seeds of tomorrow in the unnoticed details of today, that recognizes trajectories before they become obvious, consequences before they become inevitable. The psychologists study this capacity for foresight, this ability to sense where current paths will lead, and they connect it to pattern recognition, to the way certain minds naturally model possible futures based on present information. But for you, this is not an intellectual exercise. It is a constant presence, this awareness of what is coming, this recognition of danger in what others see as harmless, of endings in what is being celebrated as beginning, of the price that will be paid for choices not yet made. And you have learned not to speak of this either, because the future you perceive is rarely welcome, because people prefer their optimism untroubled by your knowing, their plans unburdened by your doubts, their present moment unmarred by your awareness of where the road is.
Leading. So you stay quiet, watch what you foresaw come to pass, experience the strange loneliness of having been right about things you wished you were wrong about, of having offered warnings that went unheeded until the predicted consequences arrived, and suddenly everyone is confused about how this happened, how no one saw it coming, when you saw it clearly months or years before and simply learned to keep that seeing to yourself. You create meaning where others see only mechanism, story where others see only sequence, purpose where others see only accident. This is not wishful thinking or magical reasoning. It is the way your mind naturally relates to existence, perceiving patterns of significance that transcend mere causality, sensing connections that cannot be reduced to simple cause and effect, finding coherence in what appears random to those who look only at the surface of things. The psychologists might call this narrative thinking, this tendency to construct meaning frameworks, and they often frame it as a cognitive bias, a way the mind tricks itself into seeing order where there is only chaos. But you know differently. You know that meaning is not something you impose on reality, but something you discover within it, that the patterns you perceive are not inventions, but revelations, that the stories you tell about existence are not escapes from truth, but attempts to articulate truths that cannot be captured in the language of pure mechanism and random occurrence. The world has largely abandoned this way of knowing, has decided that only what can be measured is real, that mystery is simply ignorance waiting to be dispelled, that meaning is a human invention rather than a human discovery. And so you learn to speak in their language, to frame your understanding in terms they can accept, to hide the full depth of your perception behind words that suggest you too believe reality is nothing more than particles in motion, chance arrangements, meaningless processes that happen to have produced conscious beings who then desperately invent significance to comfort themselves. But this is not what you actually believe, not what you actually know from your own experience of existence. You know that meaning runs through everything like water, through stone, invisible but present, shaping and being shaped, creating patterns that speak to those willing to learn the language. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from being constantly out of sync with the rhythm everyone else seems to follow naturally, from feeling like you arrived late to a dance where everyone else already knows the steps, or perhaps showed up to the wrong dance entirely while insisting the music you hear is what should be playing. You do not fit easily into the structures the world has built, the timelines it insists upon, the markers of progress and success it has decided are universal. Not because you are broken or deficient, but because the structures themselves were built.
For a different kind of consciousness, a different way of moving through time and space and social reality. You have tried to adapt to squeeze yourself into shapes that were never meant to contain you, and each time something essential gets damaged in the compression, some part of your spirit that needs more room than the world wants to give. The psychologists study this too, this experience of being neurodivergent, of having a mind that works according to different principles than the majority. And they offer explanations and sometimes medications and often strategies for better fitting into systems that were not designed with you in mind. But rarely do they question whether the systems themselves might be the problem, whether a world that requires so many souls to diminish themselves might be a world badly in need of restructuring, whether the real pathology might lie not in the minds that struggle to adapt, but in the rigidity of structures that refuse to accommodate the full spectrum of human consciousness and experience. And then you realize, perhaps suddenly or perhaps gradually over years of quiet recognition, that the pain was never about being wrong. The pain was about trying to be right in a way that denied your actual nature, about attempting to live a life that required you to be someone else, about measuring yourself against standards that were never meant for spirits like yours. This realization does not make the world easier to navigate. It does not suddenly create spaces where you fit comfortably or communities that understand you without translation. But it does something perhaps more important. It allows you to stop fighting yourself, to cease the exhausting internal war between who you are and who you think you should be, to redirect the energy you have been spending on self-correction toward the more worthwhile work of self-understanding and self-honoring. You have always been this way, not damaged by experience, not shaped by trauma into some broken version of normalcy, but fundamentally essentially different in the way your consciousness encounters reality. The psychologists can measure these differences now, can point to variations in brain structure and function, can demonstrate that what you experience is not imagination or exaggeration, but actual divergence in the mechanisms of perception and processing. But you did not need their confirmation, did you? You have always known, somewhere beneath the doubt and the training and the desperate attempts to convince yourself that you were simply doing it wrong, that with enough effort, you could learn to be like everyone else. You have always known that the difference was real, was fundamental, was not going away, no matter how skillfully you learned to hide it. The question was never whether you were different. The question was whether you could allow yourself to be different, whether you could bear the loneliness of it, whether you could survive in a world that insists there
is one right way to be human, and that way is not yours. And here you are, still asking this question, still negotiating with your own existence, still trying to find a way to honor your truth without being destroyed by the isolation it seems to demand. This negotiation never ends, does it? Each day brings new moments of choice, new opportunities to either show yourself or hide yourself, to speak your truth or offer the translation, to stand in your full strangeness or compress into more acceptable dimensions. And each choice carries weight, shapes you in ways both subtle and profound, determines not just how others see you, but how you experience your own life, your own consciousness, your own journey through this existence. The darkness visits you differently than it visits others, not as the absence of light, but as its own kind of presence, a territory you know intimately because you have spent so much time there, sometimes by choice and sometimes not by choice at all, but by the inevitable pull of a depth that will not let you stay on the surface, no matter how much easier life might be if you could. The psychologists have many names for this darkness, many frameworks for understanding depression and despair, and the various ways the human mind can turn against itself. But what they often miss is the way this darkness is not always enemy, not always illness, not always something to be cured or medicated or therapied away. Sometimes it is teacher. Sometimes it is the necessary descent that precedes any real transformation, the dissolution that must occur before any genuine renewal can take place. You know this because you have been there, in the depths where meaning falls away, and the structures you built your life upon reveal themselves as temporary and fragile and insufficient to the weight of actual existence. You know what it is to have everything you believed about yourself and your life and your purpose stripped away until you are left with nothing but the bare fact of consciousness itself, aware and suffering and unable to escape into the comfortable illusions that sustain those who have not been taken this deeply into the dark. And you know what it is to return changed, unable to unknow what you learned in that darkness, unable to believe again in the simple stories about life and meaning and purpose that once sustained you. This return is perhaps harder than the descent itself, because you come back to a world that has no language for where you have been, that regards your darkness with fear and discomfort, that wants you to pretend the journey never happened, or at least not to speak of it in ways that might disturb their own carefully maintained distance from the depths. But you cannot unknow what you know, you cannot unsee what you saw in that darkness, cannot return to the innocence of those who have not yet been broken open by their own depth. And so you live in two worlds simultaneously, participating in the surface life while
remaining always aware of what lies beneath it, speaking the language of ordinary concerns while carrying knowledge of extraordinary emptiness, going through the motions of meaning making while remembering clearly how arbitrary and constructed all meaning ultimately is. This is not despair, though it may look like it from the outside. This is a different kind of consciousness, a way of being awake that includes awareness of your own sleeping, a way of living that holds both the necessity of meaning and the knowledge of meaning's ultimate groundlessness. The psychologist might say you have existential awareness, that you think too much about matters that have no answers, that you would be happier if you could just accept life at face value and stop asking questions that lead nowhere but deeper confusion. But you cannot choose what your mind naturally contemplates any more than you can choose what your eyes naturally see. The questions come because consciousness itself is a question. Existence itself is a mystery that will not resolve into simple answers no matter how desperately the world insists otherwise. And you would rather live in the question, uncomfortable as it is, than pretend you have answers you do not actually possess, than hide in false certainties that crumble the moment any real pressure is applied. Your empathy exhausts you because it is not a choice you make, but a condition you inhabit, not a virtue you practice, but a reality you cannot escape. You feel what others feel not through imaginative projection, but through some kind of direct transmission, as if the boundaries between self and other are more permeable in you than in those who can encounter suffering without absorbing it, who can witness pain without carrying it home in their own body. The psychologists call this high empathy, affective sensitivity, emotional contagion, and they note how it correlates with both deep compassion and significant suffering. How the same capacity that allows you to truly understand another's experience also leaves you vulnerable to being overwhelmed by the weight of collective human pain. You have tried to protect yourself, to build boundaries, to learn to care without carrying, to witness without absorbing, and sometimes these practices help. Sometimes you can maintain enough distance to function without being destroyed by what you feel. But the empathy always returns, always finds its way past your defenses, always reminds you that you are not separate in the way others seem to be, that what happens to anyone happens in some way to you, that the suffering of the world is not something you can simply choose not to feel. And so you live with this constant ache of awareness, this knowledge of pain that is not your own, but might as well be for how real it feels in your body, this exhaustion that comes not from your own struggles alone, but from carrying pieces of everyone else's struggles too, whether you want to or not, whether
capacity for it or not. The world does not understand this kind of empathy. It praises compassion in theory, but is uncomfortable with its actual practice, with what it costs to truly feel with, rather than feel for, to enter into another's experience rather than observe it from safe distance. People want you to care, but not so much that it inconveniences you, not so much that it changes how you live, not so much that their pain becomes your pain in ways that cannot be easily resolved. They want your empathy to be selective, manageable, available when they need it, but not so constant that you are exhausted by it, not so deep that you cannot simply turn it off when it becomes too much to bear. But this is not how your empathy works. It does not come with an off switch. It is simply how you experience other beings, how you move through a world of consciousness that is all somehow connected, all somehow feeling together, even when pretending to be separate. You see beauty where others see only ordinary things, find the sacred in what they regard as mundane, sense the extraordinary presence that inhabits every moment if only one knows how to look. This is not romantic exaggeration or spiritual bypassing. This is actual perception, the way your consciousness naturally relates to existence, finding depth and meaning and significance in details others pass by without noticing, seeing the miracle of being alive even in the midst of difficulty and pain, recognizing that consciousness itself is the great mystery, that awareness itself is the fundamental wonder regardless of what particular contents it happens to be aware of in any given moment. The psychologists might frame this as openness to experience, as a personality trait that correlates with creativity and curiosity and certain forms of well-being. But what you experience is not a trait, but a way of being, a fundamental orientation toward reality that finds every moment somehow significant, somehow worthy of attention and wonder, somehow containing more than its surface appearance suggests. You notice the quality of light at specific times of day, the particular way a season smells as it transitions into the next, the small gestures of kindness between strangers, the moment when grief suddenly transforms into something else, the texture of silence in different spaces, the way a certain phrase can carry echoes of meanings its speaker never intended. These observations are not valuable in any practical sense. They do not help you succeed in the world's terms, do not make you more productive or efficient or capable of advancing toward the goals society insists you should pursue, but they make life worth living in ways that success and productivity never could. Ways that have nothing to do with achievement or recognition or any external validation. They allow you to be present to your own existence rather than simply passing through it, to actually inhabit the moments of your life rather than treating them as obstacles between you and some future state where things will finally be as they should be. This capacity for presence, for actually being here rather than always somewhere else in thought and worry and planning, is perhaps the greatest gift a mind like yours possesses, even though the world mostly regards it as distraction or impracticality. And now we arrive at something the psychologists rarely speak of directly, though it underlies everything they observe about minds that work differently. There is a loneliness that cannot be solved by company, a feeling of exile that has nothing to do with physical isolation and everything to do with the experience of consciousness itself. You are lonely not because you lack people around you, but because the way you experience existence seems fundamentally different from the way most others experience it. Because when you try to share what you perceive, you are met with blank stares or uncomfortable silence or well-meaning attempts to explain away what you are describing, to reduce it to something more manageable, more normal, more compatible with the consensus reality everyone else seems to inhabit comfortably. This loneliness is particular and piercing because it strikes at the core of what it means to be human. This need to be known, to be seen, to have your inner experience reflected back to you by another consciousness in a way that confirms you are not simply making it all up, not crazy or broken or alone in some absolute sense. You long for recognition, for someone to say, yes, I know this too. Yes, I see what you see. Yes, you are not strange for perceiving what you perceive or feeling what you feel or thinking in the ways you think. But this recognition comes rarely. If it comes at all, and mostly you move through the world experiencing a subtle but constant sense of being foreign, of speaking a language that sounds like everyone else's but somehow means different things, of participating in a shared reality while simultaneously aware that your experience of that reality diverges in ways you cannot adequately explain and others cannot adequately understand. The pain of this loneliness is that it has no clear solution. You cannot think your way out of it, cannot simply decide to be different than you are, cannot force your consciousness to work in ways it does not naturally work. And yet, you also cannot fully accept it, cannot entirely make peace with being this fundamentally alone in your own experience, cannot stop hoping that somewhere, somehow, you will find the recognition that would make the loneliness bearable, the companion who would make the journey less isolating. You live in this tension between acceptance and longing, between making peace with your difference and yearning for connection that does not require you to translate or simplify or hide the actual texture of your inner life. And this tension itself becomes another aspect of your difference, another way you diverge from those who seem to move through social existence with an ease you cannot imagine, who find their people without the endless searching you have done, who connect without the constant labor of bridging between your reality and theirs. But perhaps, and this is the turn that comes not with resolution but with recognition, perhaps the loneliness itself is part of what you are here to learn from, to be shaped by, to allow to reveal something essential about existence that cannot be learned any other way. Perhaps minds like yours are meant to live on the edges, to inhabit the territories between, to experience the full weight of consciousness in ways that most are spared from precisely because that weight would be too much for them to carry and continue functioning in the world's terms. Perhaps you are not broken for feeling this loneliness, but are instead perceiving something true about the human condition that others manage to ignore or deny or simply never encounter, because their consciousness does not take them into these particular depths. This is not consolation, not a way to make the loneliness hurt less or feel less real. It is simply recognition that the loneliness is not evidence of your failure to properly connect, not proof that you are doing something wrong, not indication that you need to try harder or be different, or somehow fix whatever is broken in you that prevents you from experiencing the easy connection others seem to have. The loneliness is the cost of depth, the price of seeing clearly, the necessary condition of a consciousness that cannot help but perceive more than the surface, cannot help but be aware of dimensions of existence that most others successfully ignore. And if you are going to have this kind of consciousness, if you are going to carry this depth whether you chose it or not, then the loneliness comes with it, is part of the package, is what you learn to carry alongside all the other burdens and gifts that come with a mind that works differently. You did not lose your way. You simply walked a different path than the one most people follow, a path that required you to develop different strengths, different ways of navigating different relationships to reality itself. And now you stand here carrying everything you have learned, everything you have seen, everything you have become through walking this particular path. You stand here aware of your difference, aware of your depth, aware of your loneliness and your gifts and your struggles all at once, no longer trying to pretend you are something you are not, but also not entirely certain what to do with what you actually are. This is where recognition becomes more important than resolution. You do not need to solve your difference or cure your depth or eliminate your loneliness. You need to recognize it all as valid, as real, as worthy of being honored rather than fixed. You need to stop fighting against the fundamental nature of your own consciousness and instead learn to work with it, to find ways of living that accommodate rather than combat who you actually are, to create space in your life for the solitude you need, the depth you crave, the complexity you cannot help but perceive. This is not giving up or giving in. This is finally, perhaps for the first time, actually choosing yourself, actually saying yes to your own existence as it is, rather than as you wish it could be or think it should be. The psychologists can explain the mechanisms, can map the patterns, can confirm that what you experience is real and measurable and shared by others who also carry minds that work differently. But only you can decide what to do with this knowledge, how to live with consciousness that perceives more than it sometimes wishes to perceive, feels more than it knows how to contain, understands more than it can easily communicate. Only you can choose whether to keep fighting your own nature or to finally accept it, whether to keep seeking the recognition that might never come or to recognize yourself, whether to keep waiting for the world to understand or to simply understand yourself and let that be enough. The soul remembers what the world taught it to forget. If these words touch something ancient in you, write. I remember